The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
The Tibetan Plateau, home to the largest snow and ice expanse after the Arctic and Antarctic, it is known as the world's third pole. This frozen water tower of Asia feeds 10 of the world's largest rivers, sustaining some 1.6 billion people. But Tibet's vital ecosystem is under growing threat. Natural disasters have become more prevalent in the region, caused by increasing precipitation, rising temperatures and excessive development. Join us on March 16th, bringing your ideas and queries, as our panel seeks to answer these and other pressing questions. The event will broadcast live on all social media channels of the Democracy Forum.
Hello and welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host and moderator for today's exciting Democracy Forum debate, Tibet, an environmental crisis in waiting. A subject that encompasses not just Tibet, China, politics, development, repression, but also rivers, mountains, landscapes, and how what happens there impacts in South Asia and elsewhere. And this week in London is Tibet Lobby Week, where Tibetans are hoping to raise the profile among British parliamentarians. I am privileged to have a fantastically knowledgeable panel, together with the Tibetan representative to London, Sonam, Tsering, Frasi. But first, we're going to go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to encapsulate the challenges and the issues we'll be debating today. So, Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon. Over the past half-century, the Chinese Communist Party has extended its control over the Tibet Plateau, thoroughly depleting its natural capital as a source of raw materials, energy production, and water supply, all to enable China's further economic development. This process of expropriation has created a crisis for Tibet, both political and environmental, and is now opening up the prospect of dire consequences for the ecology of Asia and its people. This is the focus for our webinar today, and in extending a warm welcome to all of you, I'd like to thank the team at the Democracy Forum for drawing together such an erudite panel of experts. We're very grateful that each has agreed to participate in this public event, discussing a topic of such profound importance. With Humphrey Hawksley, one of the United Kingdom's most distinguished Asia correspondents, in the chair. A view of the crisis facing Tibet today was clearly enunciated at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015. Recording a message for the summit, the Dalai Lama explained that Tibet is the roof of the world, the third pole. He warned that once its ecology is damaged, it will take a longer time to recover. And he emphasized that the malign environmental impact of this process will be felt by billions of human lives in China, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This is not a question of one nation or two nations, he said. This is nothing less than the survival of humanity. Readily available data point to seemingly irreversible climate change from Tibet's high altitude plateau. Temperatures are rising here at a rate 3 times faster than the global average, and it increased by 1.5 degrees centigrade over the past 50 years. Up to 70% of the plateau is covered in permafrost, where large reserves of carbon dioxide and methane lie trapped in the ice. Over 40% of the world's fresh water is locked in frozen Himalayan glaciers, feeding around 20 river systems with a combined drainage area of 10,000 square kilometers. The source of China and Asia's most important rivers, the Yangtze River, the Yellow River, the Indus, the Mekong, Brahmaputra, and the Salween all lie here. But the Chinese government's response to the alarming evidence of Tibet's loss of ecological balance appears entirely predicated on the exigencies of its latest 5-year plan. Global Energy Monitor has published evidence to show incontrovertibly that China intends to remain the world's biggest producer of greenhouse gases despite pledging carbon neutrality by 2060, and does not plan to diminish its use of fossil fuels until at least 2025, thus permitting harmful emissions to increase by at least 1% per annum until then. During last year alone, China approved the construction of more coal-burning power plants than for any year since 2015, which when taken together will generate 3 times as much thermal energy production from coal, some 73 gigawatts, as the total combined output of new coal-fired generation planned around the world last year. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is adamant that if China defers its net zero target for 40 years, then clearly it will fail to give necessary global leadership on meeting its climate change goals. There's little possibility of narrowing the gaping shortfall without China committing to faster progress, it concludes. And evidence of China's mismanagement of Tibet's resources is on an almost unimaginable scale. Take deforestation, another major contributor both to the loss of carbon sequestration and also to the accentuation of flooding and soil depletion. Data accumulated by the Tibet Policy Institute indicate that commercial logging by state-owned enterprises reduced Tibet's ancient forest cover by 46% between 1950 and 1985, a loss of over 11 million hectares. It's unarguable that such an excess of deforestation contributes directly to the frequent incidents of flooding, as highlighted in the final report of the United Nations team, which reported on the cause of the 1998 Yangtze flood. This tragic event caused the deaths of 3,000 people, displaced 15 million more, and affected the lives of a further 200 million people, almost 1/5 of the Chinese population. Writing in the current edition of Asian Affairs magazine, the sister publication of Democracy Forum, Yvonne Gill warns that as glaciers and snowlines of the Himalayas retreat, and the ancient permafrost melts away to release the now frozen carbon dioxide and methane, the waterways of the Tibetan plateau will initially cause unprecedented floods downstream, and then dry up gradually, turning the vast plateau into a biting cold desert. A parched, water-starved South and Southeast Asia and mainland China will become part of a dreadful cartographic record. Well, I'm sure you share my anxiety that Asia inescapably appears to be facing such an awful scenario. And by attending this webinar today and listening to our speakers, I'm sure you will be able to draw your own conclusions. If you'd like to raise any questions, I do encourage you to put them to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Lord Bruce, for giving us such a chilling and concise breadth and perspective there. The raw materials, the energy supplies, the expropriation, 11 million hectares on the roof of the world, and the survival of humanity. We don't understand the geography there perhaps as much as we should. Now, wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in, please send through, as Lord Bruce said, your questions and comments. Challenge us, call us to account, persuade us to change our minds, feed in an alternative point of view. This is the Democracy Forum, and we love debate. On our panel, we have John H. Knox, Zamlha Tempa Gyaltsen, Dechen Palmo, and Christa Meindersma. Each will speak for 7 to 10 minutes, during which you can question and comment through the chat box. And at the end of the debate, will be summed up by Barry Gardiner, MP, a politician who served in government on issues of sovereignty in the Northern Ireland office and as a Minister for Environment and for Climate Change, and now, most importantly, as Chair of the Democracy Forum. But first, I would like to go to the representative of the Office of Tibet in London and former member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile, Sonam Frasi, to give his viewpoint on Tibet, an environmental crisis in waiting.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is a great privilege and honor to introduce the topic of this webinar called Tibet, an environmental crisis in waiting, hosted by the Democracy Forum. I want to thank the Democracy Forum for this timely initiative. Tibet is commonly known in Tibetan poetries, prayers, literatures, songs, and other writings as Gangjong. This means land of snow, or it also means land surrounded by snow-peaked mountains. It is a true geological description of the Tibetan plateau, which is now quite commonly known as the Third Pole. The Tibetan plateau is called the Third Pole because its glaciers, ice fields, permafrost contains the largest deposit of freshwater sources outside the two polar regions. Many of the most famous rivers of Asia flow out of Tibet, making Tibet the water tower or the water reservoir for a large part of Asia, Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. These rivers are hugely significant both in terms of history and in future for the mankind. The mighty rivers, Tsangbo, you have to remember that all these rivers have our own indigenous names. So the Tsangbo becomes the Indus when it flows to India, and it is the Indus Valley civilization where the Indian civilization took hold. The Yalung Tsangbo in Tibet becomes Brahmaputra when it enters India and Bangladesh, and Yalung Tsangbo is the cradle of Tibetan civilization. The Machu, the mighty Machu, when it flows out of Tibet and comes into China, becomes the Yellow River, which is the birthplace of Chinese civilization. The mighty and famous Dichu becomes the Yangtze, which flows to Shanghai. The Zachu becomes the Mekong in Myanmar, flows to Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Ngakchu becomes the Salween in Thailand. These rivers feed most of the peoples of Asia directly and indirectly. That's almost half the population of the world. The Tibetan plateau, like its polar counterparts, is uniquely sensitive to global climate change because of its thin, high altitude and weather patterns. Temperatures are rising faster in Tibetan plateau and other high altitude areas in the world due to loss of snow and ice. This is almost unlike all other places in the world. When we look at the size of Tibet, It is a big country with a vast land area with high altitude and cold and dry climate. As a Buddhist country, there were certain traditional laws in Tibet concerned with the complete banning of hunting, fishing, deforestation, mineral extraction, together with a profound respect to the natural environment. And these have provided natural protection to Tibet's environment in the past. But during the past 62 years, since the Chinese invasion and its continued illegal occupation of Tibet, and due to the global warming, the Tibetan plateau is surely in crisis. Scientific research analysis show that Tibetan glaciers have been retreating together with the permafrost since 1970 at an alarming and existential rate unless international efforts are made. Crisis in environmental issue in Tibet has adversely impacted the Tibetan society already. The Chinese Communist state, in the name of to protect the headland of river that feeds the Yangtze, the Mekong, have involved uprooting, reallocating, and resettlement of thousands and thousands and thousands of Tibetans from their indigenous land, from their ancestral land. For the countries and populations around Tibet, there are major implications too. Some are already witnessing in the form of huge monsoon change in pattern, landslides, disastrous floods and drought cycles. If the present projections are correct, in the decades to come, there will be a progressive reduction and indeed outright collapse of the capacity of the major river systems flowing out of Tibetan plateau. This will mean it will not be able to support the agriculture and industries across Asia. The consequences of this are enormous because this will trigger the real question of sustainability of human population in this populated region of the blue planet. The upheavals that might be in store are stark. Mass population movement, migration crisis, potential regional conflict are obvious. Regardless of any political and cultural views, the environmental impact on the Tibetan plateau, the third pole, is one of the key issues of our time. To mitigate and plan for such a future requires a sustained international response focused on the preservation of Tibetan plateau as well as on the question of Tibet's sovereignty. As early as in 1987, His Holiness the Dalai Lama visualized Tibet acting as a zone of peace in the heart of Asia, not just political or military peace, but also an environmental peace, an idea that is central to the Tibetan worldview. So, with this, I would like to conclude my short presentation with a quotation from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He said, "The future of Tibet contains within it the future of the whole of Asia. As we can see now with this extension, it is clearly for the whole world to watch." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonam, for that brilliantly canvas that you painted for us. I wondered, before we let you go, if I could ask you to give a slightly personal description. You were born in 1954 in Rawang Nagari in Tibet. Tell us where that is, what it was like, what you know or remember of it, and how that has changed with this environmental expropriation that we're hearing about now.
Rawang is in the western part of Tibet. I am born to a nomadic family, and as a geographical idea of where it could be is, if you remember where the Kailash mountain is, where the four biggest rivers, the Satluj, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, comes out from the lake Mapam Yuso. I was born quite near to it, to a nomadic family. I don't have big recollections, but few lands and small things.
And what is that place like now? Is there deforestation? Is there mining? Is it completely changed?
That area in itself is more or less a very arid land. So there weren't any forest to be cut off. It was really a dry area with really substantially only nomadic lifestyle could exist.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you very much, and thank you for your opening presentation. We're now going to the first panelist. It's John H. Knox, who's an expert in the human rights law and international environment law. It's where those two topics get together. And from 2012 to 2015, he served as the first United Nations independent expert, and then to 2018, the first special rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So, John H. Knox, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to say thank you to the Democracy Forum for inviting me to participate today. I also want to make clear at the outset that I am not an expert on Tibet, so I will speak more generally about the relationship between human rights and the environment, but then I will make some observations about their application to Tibet based on my work, as Humphrey said, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. So I think it's becoming well understood that the world is facing several interlocking environmental crises: the climate crisis, the global loss of biodiversity, the rising tide of pollutants and toxic substances. What I think it's less well understood is that these crises are also human rights crises. Human rights and environmental protection are fundamentally interdependent. We can only enjoy human rights, including our rights to life and health, if we have a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment that enables us to enjoy those rights. But at the same time, we can only effectively protect the environment if we protect human rights, if we're able to exercise our rights, such as our rights to information, public participation, and access to effective remedies. This can create a kind of a virtuous circle, that is, protecting human rights leads to better environmental protection and vice versa, or a vicious circle, that is, if the failure to protect human rights contributes to environmental harm and in turn environmental degradation undermines human rights. This relationship can be recognized in terms of a human right to a healthy environment, and more than 100 countries have so recognized it by adopting a right in their national constitution. Many others have recognized it in regional treaties, but many important states have not, including China, but also the United Kingdom and the United States. And the United Nations itself has never recognized an explicit right to a healthy environment, although there is a growing wave for support, a wave of support for such right, which I hope may result in recognition perhaps as soon as this year. In the absence, however, of such an explicit right, international and domestic human rights bodies have greened human rights. That is, they have taken existing human rights, such as rights to life and health, and applied them and explained how they apply in the environmental context. And in particular, they've made clear that states have obligations to protect against environmental harm in order to protect against the effects of such harm on human rights. So what does that mean? That means in particular that states have obligations, for example, to ensure that people affected by potential harm have information about that harm, that they have the right to participate in decision-making about it, that they have access to effective remedies. States have obligations not to discriminate in the application of their environmental and other standards in ways that might differentiate between peoples and especially harm those who are most at risk. They have obligations to set effective environmental standards and then enforce them. These all have implications for the full range of environmental harms facing Tibet. For example, as Lhasa and other urban sites in Tibet rapidly grow and industrialize, the potential threat to the cleanliness of the air and water rapidly increases as well. In addition, Tibetans face problems with so-called household air pollution. That is, for example, particulate air pollution emitted from burning sources such as wood and yak dung for cooking and heating. These sources of environmental harm require the authorities not only to take steps to address them, but also to provide reliable information and opportunities for those affected to participate in decisions about how to address the harm. In other words, a rights-based approach requires not only remedial action, but also forward-looking preventive action, and requires that this action be undertaken with the input and knowledge of local residents. Let's say a word about climate change in this respect. Like other mountainous regions, Tibet is warming more rapidly than areas at lower elevation. This has implications, which I think the panel will discuss later, for Tibet's role as Asia's water tower. And the transboundary downstream effects of melting glaciers have been studied and have received great attention, as they should. But it's important not to overlook the effects of climate change on the people of Tibet themselves. Much of the Tibetan plateau is in a permafrost zone, and therefore in Tibet, as elsewhere, when permafrost melts, it affects the traditional growing seasons for farmers, the habitat for pastoral species, and the availability of fresh water for irrigation and watering animals. Again, a rights-based approach says that the Chinese government has obligations to assist the inhabitants of Tibet to adapt to these effects, but also that the inhabitants have rights to information about the effects and rights to participate in the decision-making process. Moreover, they have the rights of freedom of expression and association to raise concerns and objections to steps taken by authorities, even if those steps are taken in the name of environmental protection or mitigation of climate change. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. China has received praise for designating many protected areas in Tibet. Indeed, it's been suggested that China is trying to develop a national park system largely in Tibet, much like that of the United States. But the fear is that, like the national parks in the United States, China not create these new protected areas by excluding those who live in them from their traditional lands. When I was the special rapporteur, I received a communication, for example, alleging that the Ho Chi National Park, accepted in 2017 as a World Heritage Site, would exclude everyone from the park except for security personnel. And in 2018, in one of my last acts before my term expired, I and the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, Karima Benoon, sent a joint communication to China expressing our concern about these allegations and asking that the government tell us whether and how they have provided information to local communities and consulted with them before taking these steps, and what steps, if any, the government had taken to ensure that they had alternative sources of livelihood. China did respond. It did deny that it had taken measures to relocate the pastoralists and point to actions it said it was taking to ensure that they received benefits. But it did not address our concerns about consultation and public participation in decision-making. I want to emphasize that the creation and administration of new protected areas requires the involvement and perhaps even the consent of local communities. The requirement of free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, as it's often known by its English acronym, is often considered as a right of indigenous peoples, and this characterization can be controversial in Tibet, where the concept of indigenousness is not always claimed by local communities, and in any event is not recognized by the authorities. But there's a common misunderstanding here. The question of the rights of local communities to have a say in how their traditional lands are affected by government action is not limited to indigenous peoples. Rather, the question is whether the local communities have such a close connection and dependence on their ancestral land that their rights to enjoy their culture, their religion, their way of life, their very existence as a minority with distinctive characteristics depends on protecting that relationship. So rather than become sidetracked on issues of whether Tibetan pastoralists and nomads are indigenous, the better questions are whether they have this kind of special relationship with their ancestral land, and if so, whether their rights to have access to that land have been denied without their free, prior, and informed consent. Before I close, I'd like to make one more cross-cutting point. The core of a rights-based approach to environmental protection is the protection of the rights of environmental human rights defenders. That is, those who work to protect not only their own rights, but the rights of others. This means that China, like every other country, has an obligation to protect the rights of those who criticize its policies, not to detain them or prosecute them for peaceful actions and protest, and an obligation to investigate and punish actions taken to persecute them. Unfortunately, these rights are often not protected in many countries, perhaps most countries, in the world. Environmental defenders are often at grave risk. In recent years, UN special rapporteurs have sent multiple communications to China, raising concerns about credible allegations that Tibetans who protest against mining operations or raise other environmental issues, as well as other human rights issues, such as the right to teach Tibetan language in school, that these people have been the subject of persecution, unlawful detention, and convictions. For example, I joined with other special rapporteurs in 2016 in sending a communication to China regarding the peaceful protest against a mining project in Amchok Township at the end of May and beginning of June 2016. Again, in 2018, I joined with other special rapporteurs in sending a communication to China in which the Chinese police allegedly resorted to excessive use of force to violently disperse a peaceful protest involving approximately 100 Tibetan environmental human rights defenders demonstrating against environmentally harmful mining activities in Kamyu Shul. More recently, and since my term ended just last year, a minority human rights defender named Anya Singdra, a nomad and community leader in Tibet, who was campaigning against illegal mining activities and illegal hunting and poaching, was arrested by Chinese security officers, detained, and ultimately charged and apparently convicted of picking quarrels and provoking trouble, and sentenced to 7 years in prison. I just want to make the obvious point. Without protecting the rights of freedom of expression and association, the other human rights I've discussed are all at risk because they cannot be defended except at great peril. As I began by saying, to protect the environment, it is necessary to protect human rights. Thank you again for inviting me to participate, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists in the ensuing conversation.
John, thank you so much for that, giving that balance. I want to talk to you about human rights and the environment and development, but Anand Tomar has sort of sent in a question saying, is development compatible with a respect for the cultural and religious beliefs of the Tibetan people? Can I just put that to you and add a little bit to it? Is that when you're balancing up these various rights and laws, is it the right of the culture and the environment, or is it the right to have a road that can go to a port or a hospital that people want? How is all that balanced out when you're doing these issues?
So different societies can reach different conclusions about how to strike this balance between economic development and other forms of social development and environmental protection. The major point here is, though, that you cannot strike this balance without respecting the human rights to participate and have input of those who are most directly affected. You can't impose this balance on people against their will, so that absolutely societies can decide to have development in ways that change the environment, and even they can decide to put up with a certain amount of environmental harm, but they cannot do so on a discriminatory basis, and they can't do so on a basis that excludes the participation and input of the rights generally of those who are most affected.
And that's under international law. That's United Nations international law, essentially, is it?
Yeah, exactly. These are international human rights standards I'm referring to here. Although they're often expressed in the idea of sustainable development, which is a principle that the United Nations applies in many different contexts. You have the right to develop, but the right needs to take into account the rights of others. It needs to be sustainable development, not untrammeled development.
And China, as we know, has little regard for international law and issues like the South China Sea or the Indian border or whatever. So there's the law, and then there's what great powers do. So given the new US administration and the meetings that are taking place with China now, do you expect there to be any substantive change, or is what is happening in Tibet and elsewhere with China a sort of juggernaut that's unstoppable and is going to keep doing what it's doing?
Well, on this one, I have to say, China is not the only state that does not, let's say, pay sufficient attention to human rights in making these kinds of decisions. These are problems that many states, that many people in different states face all around the world. And so when you ask me how optimistic I am, it really depends kind of on the day, honestly. I mean, these are enormous problems, and China, like other states, again, they're not unique in this, has traditionally not done enough, I think, to protect the rights of people from environmental harm. And I'm hopeful, but I wouldn't say confident, that we'll see improvement in the future.
Okay, thank you. That gives us a great sort of platform to where I'm going to the head of the Environment and Development Desk at the Tibet Policy Institute, Zamlha Gyaltsen, who's an expert on the social and environmental impact of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau, that roof of the world that we've been hearing about, and what happens there can impact the whole of humanity, or directly half of the world's population. And the research covers both natural disasters, mining, garbage littering, that whole crisis going on there. So Zamlha, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to speak about the increasing cases of natural disaster in Tibet that we have seen in recent years, particularly since 2015. And there is a new form of climatic reality emerging on the Tibet Plateau. And now, before I go into the actual presentation, I also like to speak on why we talk about Tibet Plateau, why it is so important that we talk about Tibet Plateau, and what are the implications from increasing cases of natural disaster on the Tibet Plateau to the neighboring countries and the regions across Asia. Now, Tibet Plateau, if you can see on the screen, is called roof of the world because Tibet Plateau, with an area of 2.5 million square kilometers, it occupies about 2% of Earth's land surface, which makes it, had Tibet been an independent state, it could have been the 10th largest country by area. So, also Tibet Plateau stands at an average elevation of more than 4,000 meters above sea level. So scientifically, scientists have described Tibet as the largest and highest plateau ever existed in geological history of the Earth. Now, also, because of its high elevation and massive surface area, Tibet Plateau is also the third pole. Now, why is Tibet Plateau is called third pole? It's because Tibet Plateau is home to third largest concentration of ice beside North Pole and South Pole. With 46,000 glaciers on the plateau, Tibet Plateau is home to almost all of ice in Asia. Now, because of the presence of ice on the Tibet Plateau and the massive surface area and its high elevation, Tibet Plateau also influences climate conditions across Asia and as far as Europe and North America. Now, there are scientific findings that state that the timing and intensity of Indian monsoon is influenced by what's happening on the Tibet Plateau. There are other scientific findings which has linked that the recent increase in heat waves across Europe is also due to loss of glacier on the Tibet Plateau. And there are also other scientific findings which has linked that the greater the snowfall on the Tibet Plateau, warmer it is in North America, particularly in Canada. So the importance of the Tibet Plateau is not only across Asia, but also to Europe and North America. And finally, the importance of the Tibet Plateau can be understood from the term Tibet as the water tower of Asia, which our representative Frasi had a detailed presentation. Now, to give you a brief explanation on why Tibet Plateau is called the roof of the water tower of Asia, is it because Tibet Plateau is head source of Asia's largest rivers, flowing into 10 most densely populated nations on Earth, supporting 1.8 billion people across Asia, which is almost 40% of world's population. Now, going into the actual presentation, increasing cases of natural disasters on the Tibet Plateau. Now, if you could see on the screen, here I have put up a few pictures and a map. And the map shows particular areas where the natural disasters happened. And because there has been so many natural disasters happening since 2016, I will highlight one incident from each year. Now, why since 2016? Before 2016, there were natural disasters in Tibet, but were few and isolated cases. But since 2016, there has been simultaneous landslides, floods, forest fire across the plateau, particularly during the summer. Now, first, in 2016, there was a massive mud flood which brought along with it dozens of wild animals because of that that particular mudslide. And that mudslide also killed 2 people and injured 30 others. Now, the most likely cause was increased rainfall, rising temperature, permafrost degradation, and also possible deforestation and excessive construction activities on the mountains as well. And in 2017, there was a massive collapse of a mountain. A whole face of a mountain collapsed, and killing 9 people in their sleep and buried many homes. Now, this particular collapse of the mountain was again due to melting of permafrost and also increased precipitation, and also possible increased construction activity on the slope as well. And in 2018, there was an unprecedented and very unusual scene of a nomadic tent being inundated by our lake. Now, what happened was a summer pasture was completely inundated because of increased precipitation and also melting permafrost. As permafrost melt, the ground released a large amount of volume of water, and also surging rivers nearby. And then in 2019, during the winter of 2019, there was an extreme snowfall in northern part of Tibet, in which thousands of domestic cattle as well as wild animals were buried under the snow. And in 2020, there was again another massive flood in one particular area in eastern Tibet. And the area has faced repeated flood since 2016. Now, I would like to focus on one particular landslide that fortunately wasn't as bad as it could have been, but could have been a massive disaster. Now, the landslide is called Bolo Twin Landslide. 2 landslides happened within 1 month. And the first landslide occurred on 11th October 2018, in which 23 million cubic meters of rock and earth debris fell from a 3,000-meter slope. And the force of the landslide was so huge that the debris from the landslide were piled on the other side of the river up to 300 feet high. And the landslide quickly blocked the river and created a barrier lake with 290 million cubic meter of water. Now, this particular landslide happened in eastern Tibet on the Dichu or Yangtze River. Now, it's important to note that Yangtze River is one of the largest and longest river in Asia and in the world. Fortunately, what happened was on the 3rd day of the landslide naturally created a spillover, and the barrier lake collapsed, causing minimal damage to the community nearby. But on 3rd November 2018, after 23 days of the first landslide, there was another landslide on the very same spot, in which 3.5 million cubic meter of rock mass fell from 3,000 to 3,800 meters of slope. And the same landslide also brought about 8.5 million cubic meter of debris deposited from the previous landslide. Now, this second landslide blocked the same river, the world's third longest river and Asia's longest river, for 11 days. Now what happened with that is, as the landslide blocked the river for 11 days, the river, the new barrier lake, gradually moved upward, threatening almost all of the villages located along the river. Now, the river moved upward as far to a distance of almost 17 kilometers from the spot of the landslide to the border town. And what happened was, because the landslide and the blockage was so massive, huge, that the barrier lake, as it moved upward, it inundated whole of Bolo town, monasteries, office buildings, village, and 23 villages were lost under the surging river. So it took Chinese government 11 days to break that barrier lake, and for the first 5 days there were no activity at all. Now, so what this clearly indicates is that despite China being so powerful, they are ill-prepared or less concerned about what's happening on the Tibet Plateau. Now, there are certain information stating that some of the landslide, one of the probable cause for the landslide could be, again, excessive construction work in the region as well. But of course, there were other issues as well that I will highlight in my later slide. Now it is also important to understand why this particular river is very important. Now, if you can see on the screen, here a map of Tibet. As I mentioned earlier, Yangtze River is the third longest river in the world and the longest river in Asia, and it supports. It is the sixth largest river by discharge volume in the world, and it flows across almost all of southern Chinese provinces, supporting about 400 million people. And it is also on the same river basin area, China has built 50,000 dams, which is almost 57% of all of China's dams. And it is also on the same river, China has built the massive Three Gorge Dam, the world's biggest dam, hydropower dam. So, had the landslide happened in summer, when the river volume was at its highest level, the implication could have been horrifying. Fortunately, the landslide happened in the winter when the river volume was at its lowest. So what are the possible causes? Now, it's important to understand what are the possible causes. So there are surely many factors, but as per my understanding, there are 10 most likely factors. Number one, rising temperature. And number two, increased precipitation. Now, because of climate change, Tibet has seen increased precipitation and rising temperature since 1950s, and particularly within the last few decades. Now, that rising temperature has caused increased melting of glaciers and thawing of permafrost. And increased precipitation has put Tibetans at a greater risk, because Tibet has been on land with the minimum rainfall is facing a new challenge, a challenge that the people are not ready for. And then rapid urbanization. Rapid urbanization has caused any impact of climate change or any impact of disaster to be greater. And also excessive resource extraction and excessive construction activities in the last few years has been primary reason as factor as well. Now, number 6 is lack of climate change awareness. Now, this is important. The lack of climate change awareness, both among government officials as well as the general public, has put people unprepared and unaware of the possible risk. So due to lack of climate change awareness, there's also lack of climate change adaptation. And the number 8 is the lack of strong environmental groups. So as mentioned by previous speakers, the lack of strong environmental groups in Tibet has put Chinese mining companies, dam construction companies, government officials to do anything that they wish to, despite Chinese President Xi Jinping claiming to put environment as a priority for the Chinese government. There are no proper social impact assessment and environmental impact assessment prior to any major development work in Tibet. And finally, the lack of trust between Chinese government and the Tibet people has led to understanding and a lack of awareness and a lack of preparedness from any of these natural disasters. So to conclude, I would say that this new climate reality in Tibet, with increased cases of natural disaster, has put Tibetans in Tibet as well as people in Asia at a great risk. So what it requires is a collective effort from the Tibet people, the Chinese government, and the people and government across Asia and Europe and America to work to understand the possible factors and also to put forth necessary policies, infrastructure, and recommendations to address this risk. Thank you very much. I will conclude with that statement.
Thank you. My learning curve has gone way up there, but I have a question that crops up from all this. Is that, are these all Chinese companies that are doing the mining and the development and the extraction, or are they joint ventures? And where is the first stage of the supply chain from it that, would, on the mining and that international companies get involved?
In the early years, there has been few international collaborations, but in the recent years, China has become so powerful that many of the mining companies and dam construction are state-owned Chinese companies, which means they have free hand to do anything they wish to, and also they are supported by Chinese government officials who have invested massively into those companies. So it is very difficult to protest against any Chinese mining or dam construction activities in Tibet, despite Tibetans not being benefiting at all.
And then are the raw materials going into China, or are they sold internationally?
Now, China has accelerated mining across Tibet, particularly in the recent years, because they have improved road connectivity. They have built railway lines. They have increased the number of highways. So this has made transportation easier, and which has enabled large Chinese mining companies to increase its production and extraction. And many of these raw materials are went to China, went to Eastern China, where it has been manufactured or into more finished products.
Right. So there's no way that the international business community or the international community as such can specifically get involved in this situation because the raw materials are not going into global supply chains.
No, they are definitely going. Tibet, particularly copper. Tibet is very rich in copper, and also lithium has been a new resource that China has extensively extracted in recent years in Eastern Tibet, and the lithium is being used across the globe, and China exports lithium. Tibetan lithium be exported on global market.
Okay, so there is Philip Bowman. I'd like to give you his question. How can the Tibetan people reap some advantages from their reserves of copper, silver, etc., since it's against their religious practice to mine the land? Could you perhaps explain that and answer it a bit?
So, now Tibetans are not against development, but what we are against is we are against form of development which disregards and disrespects Tibetan people's cultural way of life, religious sentiments. Now, here's a good example. Many of Chinese mining companies start mining extraction on sacred mountains. And Tibetan sacred mountains are very rich in the mineral resources. That's why they are sacred mountains, because they withhold the fertility of the soil. So here is the conflict. Conflict is not against development, it's against mining on sacred mountains.
Okay, that's so. I mean, you as an academic researcher there, you didn't actually say necessarily it could have been a number of causes, these natural disasters, but they all mesh into each other, don't they? Because climate change, development, and then irresponsible mining and that sort of thing, without any transparency in whether or not they do cause these natural disasters. There's nothing that we can look up from the Chinese government that investigates these things. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Lack of transparency, lack of strong environmental groups, and a lack of proper law, and a lack of concern from the Chinese government. Now, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has been making a lot of effort on climate change. But if you go down on the ground in Tibet, local Chinese officials have very little understanding about climate change and very little concern for environment. That's where the contradiction comes in.
Okay, and I can ask you this, and I probably widen it out to the panel. Would it be helpful if there was some form of sanction or pressure on the international companies that deal in lithium and copper and all that sort of thing, or would that be detrimental to what you're trying to achieve?
I think there should be a strong international collaboration to monitor what's happening in Tibet, and particularly the international companies who are collaborating with the Chinese mining companies. There should be accountability. There should be transparency. So that would definitely help.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Stay around for our question and answer because your detail there was fascinating. And we're now going to go to Dechen Palmo, an environment researcher at the Tibet Policy Institute, who knows about China's strategic interests, particularly around the rivers, the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, and the other rivers. So Dechen Palmo, tell us what you know.
Hello. Hello, everyone. And thank you for the introduction, Humphrey. And I would like to thank Democracy Forum for putting this together and giving us the opportunity to come together. It's really been interesting listening to the previous speaker, and I'm delighted to be able to share this platform with all of you. Today, I'll be speaking on the pertinent issues of China's damming of Tibet's river and its impact. So we can see here that Tibet, in this map, Tibet is the source of Asia's major river. Hence, it is known as the water tower of Asia. And Tibet River is sustaining more than 1.5 billion people. And with the Chinese occupation of Tibet, Beijing now has full control over these rivers flow. So once this river were a free-flowing river, now being dammed everywhere. Next. And before we move on with my presentation, I would like to give a brief background information about the Chinese damming crisis. So before the Chinese Communist Party came into power in 1949, there were only 22 dams of any significant size in China. But now in China, according to the International Commission on Large Dams, China has 23,841 large dams, which account for 41% of the world's total. And if we compare with the UK has only 580 large dams. So we can see how many dams China have built in Tibet and in China itself. So in 2018, China hydropower accounted for roughly 18% of China's electricity generation and 90% of China's installed power capacity. As the world's most dam countries, China is now already a world largest producer of hydropower with an installed generating capacity of more than 356 gigawatt. And China is also one of 3 countries that have voted against the UN Watercourse Convention. And this gives China the full leverage over the use of international rivers that flows from the Tibet. So today I will speak on one particular river, that is Mekong River. And this Mekong River, it has source in Tibet, and it's also one of the most fertile rivers on earth. And it's nurturing millions of people with its nutrient-rich waters and fisheries. But the series of Chinese dams have robbed this river richness. And this river is the longest river and most important waterways in Asia, Southeast Asia. And flowing from Tibet, it flows into 6 different countries: China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia, and Vietnam. Now, this river sustaining more than 70 million people, 85% of its inhabitants make their living daily from the river, largely from farming and fishing. And this river, during the dry season, water originating from Tibet can account for roughly more than half of the river volumes. And this number can rise to as much as 70% during drought and during dry season. So we can clearly see how important the flow of Mekong is from Tibet. And now in this map, we can see that China has long planned to build 19 dams on its upstream portion of the Mekong. And 11 of these dams are now completed, and most recent being the 990 megawatt Unalong Dam. So combined of all these completed dams could generate 21,310 megawatts of electricity, which is enough to provide power to a medium-sized country. And the 7 remaining dams on this list will be built on the Tibet, and it will store the runoff of melting Himalayan glaciers into the next decade. So today I'll speak on one particular dam on the Mekong River, and this is the latest dam which was built on the Unalong Dam, and this was completed in 2018, which have caused a huge impact on the local Tibetan communities. And this Unalong impact, which it was recorded by Brian Eiler, who is the author of Mighty Mekong, author of the last Mighty Mekong. And in next slide, yeah. And this is the Google map, which I've got it from Google Earth. And here we can see that there's two village. One is the Yanmen village, and another one is Shizong village. And on the end, we can see that there's a Unalong Dam at the end. And this, in particular case study, where the Shizong village, it's a village in Dechen, Tibet Autonomous Prefecture in Yunnan province. And this village is 40 kilometers upstream of the construction site of the Unalong Dam. This Shizong village sits on a small plateau 100 meters above the Mekong River. And this and another village, the Yanmen, which is an upstream community with more than 200 plus households, were entirely, this Yanmen village were entirely relocated to the Shizong village. And this Yanmen, which sits low along the bank of the Mekong, were completely flooded by the Wunolong reservoirs. And in this picture, we can see that in 2012 and 2020, and in Shizong village in 2012, we can see that it's a beautifully, there's lots of space for agriculture. And compared with the 2020 picture, where the concrete building were built on the this rice paddy, and all this white concrete building were built for the new resettled Yanmen community who were resettled there. So this relocation, it has affected both the Shizong and the Yanmen community, and to make a way and a space for Yanmen villagers, these Shizong villagers, they have lost their land. And this Shizong village, it used to be very famous for two things. And one is that the Shizong village is like mostly around 80% of villages were local Catholic, local member of local Catholic Church, and it was established in 19th century by a French missionary. So most of the Shizong villages were Christian Catholic, whereas the Yanmen community who were relocated there were the Buddhist community people. And the Shizong, second is the Shizong, it's a home to growing cottage wine industry, which was also introduced by a French missionary. However, all these things have changed with the Wunolong Dam. And this Wunolong Dam, this just threatened not just the Shizong local economy that has delivered the modest level of prosperity to the village over the past 30 years, but also the village's harmony between the local Tibetan Catholic and the Buddhists. So the Shizong is a Catholic community and Yanmen is a Buddhist community. So people are worried that despite the common ethnic heritage, the influx of more Buddhists will upset the community spirit and social interaction. Now, when we talk about the participation on finding the full solution for the resettled community, or the where the and also the Yanmen and Shizong villages, and though the people have like Chinese government claim that they have a law and all those regulations, but when it comes to the relocation and the people who are suffering because of the relocation, there were no avenue for the legal recourse, and no one is coming to aid the village. So this demoralizing effect of Wunolong Dam are obvious, and there's nowhere to turn for assistance or relief. So in 2014, Shizong former mayor, who had held a meeting with the villagers, and the villagers who have filed grievances regarding the construction of Wunolong Dam and imminent invasion. And there's one person who has attended the meeting. His name has been changed, and his name was put as a Tershi. And during an interview with Brian Eiler, he has said that the mayor, the former mayor, he had become very enraged at the persistent villagers, and said, "This land, this water, this mountain, they are not yours. Stop acting like these are yours." So this is a state land, and these are the state resources. This is what the former mayor has said to the villagers. And but the Shizong villagers who have lived in this valley for centuries, and whose ancestors have lived in this valley, and the Chinese state, they have recently laid this claim on these resources in the past few decades, right? So it is very easy to understand how their identity is formed by the landscape around them. And how can a state, and Tashi, he have said that how can a state own their rivers? The rivers, like the land and mountains around us is a part of us, said Tashi. So besides this, land compensation is also an issue of major contention in Shizong, and more than half of the Shizong agricultural protective land were used either to build homes for Yemen residents or to be redistributed to the newcomers for agricultural use. So Shizong villagers, they have received 30,000 yuan per MU of land, which was lost to Yemen relocation. But villagers believe that their land value is more than 10 times the initial offer. And they also claim that the electricity generation generated by the Wunalong will not be distributed to the Shizong. Earlier, they have adjacent to the village, there was one small dam which was built near the village. But when the dam was built and the developer, they have promised that they will give the electricity for free, 500 units of electricity for free, but this promise were never fulfilled. And not a single Shizong villagers were employed in the construction of small-scale power station near the village. And this price of electricity has also gone high in the village. So this construction of dams on the Mekong in Tibetan area, it has impact beyond the borders, beyond the Tibetan community. So it has a repercussion around the wider world also. So there were drought over the many past years have severely hurt the farming and fishing in Laos and Thailand, Cambodia, and all those downstream countries. And many of scientists and many of the researchers, they blame China's 11 dam on the upper Mekong, as well as climate change. However, during the Lankan Mekong Cooperation meeting in February 2020, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he blamed that historically low water level on the drought and said China suffered from it too and promised to help Mekong countries to mitigate the drought. Moreover, he also claimed that this cascade of reservoirs along the river helped to alleviate the drought downstream. However, Chinarong, who is a lecturer and a Mekong expert at Mahasankaram University in northeastern Thailand, he has said that water released by China is political and it made out to be them doing a favor. And instead, he said, they create the damage but ask for gratitude. So we can clearly see that these dams have impact beyond the borders. So the image which was portrayed by the Minister Wang was one of the benevolent China willing to help its neighbors during the time of hardship. But a new study which was funded by a US government and painted a less rosy picture what Minister Wang had claimed. And in that report, it was said that China was not experiencing the same hardship at all. Instead, China's dam appear to have directly caused the record low water level by limiting the river flow. This research firm, Eyes on Earth, found that Chinese dams are holding back large amount of water upstream on the Mekong, which exacerbates severe drought in the Southeast Asian countries downstream last year. And this report, which was that found that a Mekong upper basin in China actually received above average precipitation in 2019. And this had the Mekong flow not been obstructed by Chinese dams, the downstream countries would have experienced slightly higher than usual water level. So this study developed by a reliable and simple model that predict that natural flow of the upper Mekong that used the prediction to determine how cascade of dam built on the upper Mekong is altering the natural flow of the river. This foundation of this study is based on the satellite data from 1992 to 2019 and the daily river height gauge data from the Gyaltsen, Thailand. So overall, during this 28 years of period, they studied the gauge and Mr. Bassett and his colleague, who is the author of this research, they have calculated that dams in China have held back more than 410 feet of river's height. So in this picture, we can see that this precipitation map, they show that the upper Mekong have received an above average rainfall during 2019 wet season compared to the previous 18 years, which is quite opposite to what China has claimed. And Chinese dam, they have held back so much water that they entirely prevented the annual monsoon-driven rise in the river level at Shankanson. So this question comes with so many dams, but at what cost? And although hydropower dam, China hailed this as a clean energy. However, it has many side impact. So hydropower have impact on the local ecology. It reduces biodiversity by disrupting the flow of the water and the sediments, and which is critical for maintaining physical process and habitat downstream of the dam. So it also caused loss of fisheries, and dam also caused greenhouse gas emission, which led to the global warming. And with so much of water behind the dam, this weight can also actually increase the seismic hazard and landslide in the vicinity. And these dams are also vulnerable to earthquake. So this dam have also caused huge erratic and devastating effect on the water flow downstream. So, and besides this, this also caused a permanent resettlement of those whose homes were flooded within the reservoirs. So the question comes, when permanent resettlement happened due to the dams, would those affected be given enough money to start a new life elsewhere? How would the peasant farmer deal with the urban environment? Would the moves add to the region's crowding problem? Would the psychological impact of being forced off the land on which family might have dwelt for generations? So all these issues should be considered by the government before moving on with the project on dam building. So this is the four association which to protect Tibet's river, and China, they have already built most of its dam on the portion of its internal rivers. Now they are eyeing on the rivers which flows from Tibet, such as Mekong, Tsering, Brahmaputra, and all these major international rivers. So before planning any damming project, they must do a proper and transparent environmental impact assessment. Second, China's dam building program must take neighbors into account, because it has whatever happens on Tibetan rivers, on the upper portion of the river, has impact on the downstream countries. And third, Beijing treats information about water flow and hydropower operation as a state secret. So this lack of transparency allows China to set a narrative of shared suffering due to the drought. To build a trust between the countries, there are needs for greater transparency in data sharing and cooperation to improve the management of the Mekong River. And fourth, and more scientific research must be undertaken to understand the full impact of dam. So what happens in Tibet have impact beyond the Tibetan borders. The time has come to exert concerted external pressure on Beijing to rein in its dam frenzy and embrace international environmental standards. Thank you.
Much for that. Quite chilling stuff, really. The fundamental questions there: how can a state own a river? And the release of water is political. You can turn the tap on and you can turn it off, causing a catastrophe elsewhere. There's a couple of questions, but I just want to move on, Dechen, and then we're going to come back to you on the question and answer session that we're going to have, because I want to finish up with Christa Meindersma, United Nations advisor on peace operations, who's lived and worked in Tibet and even got shot by the Chinese military in the 1988 protests. And I told her before we went on that she's looking very good on it, so I hope you weren't shot too badly. She's a member of the Board of International Campaign for Tibet in Europe and meets the Dalai Lama on a regular basis. Christa is going to be sharing her thoughts on climate advocacy in Tibet and why it should be central to the international agenda. Christa?
Mr. Hawksley, Lord Bruce, and the Democracy Forum, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak about international advocacy on climate change affecting the Tibetan Plateau during this panel. As you said, as a former UN diplomat and someone who lived and worked in Tibet, advocacy on climate change on the Tibetan Plateau is a topic very close to my heart. Let me start by stating the obvious. climate change and the protection of biodiversity on the Tibetan Plateau must be on the international agenda. These are some of the most urgent issues of our times, but still largely and perhaps conveniently overlooked by international policymakers. Tempa and Dechen's research indicates that serious consequences of climate change are affecting the Tibetan Plateau and surrounding regions. Their findings are corroborated by research done by Professor Martin Mills of the University of Aberdeen, who analyzed 900 scientific papers on climate change affecting the plateau. In this paper that makes chilling reading and that everyone ought to take to heart, he concludes that, and I quote, "It is clear that even if the 1.52 degrees centigrade limitations of the 2015 Paris Agreement are met, the third pole cryosphere is nonetheless undergoing a catastrophic and irreversible ecological shift. The implication of this is that, even with adherence to the Paris Agreement's targets at a global level, regional governments will be faced with massive adaptation costs and hard adaptation limits. Specifically in those regions where freshwater supplies are significantly compromised by changes in the water cycle, the ability to maintain large urban centers, surplus agriculture production and viable industry will be dramatically downgraded and possibly eradicated." End of quote. This will not only affect the 1.5 billion or so population of Southeast Asia, but also a large portion of the world's population that is dependent on food produced in these regions. Yet the sense of urgency about climate emergency on the Tibetan Plateau on the part of the international policymakers is lacking. There are important international conferences where concerns about environmental situation in Tibet should be raised. In particular, the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow and the Biodiversity Convention in Kunming. Climate change is inextricably linked to the biodiversity loss on the Tibetan Plateau. The Tibetan Plateau encompasses 3 biodiversity hotspots, defined as the Earth's most biologically rich but threatened terrestrial regions. Drivers of climate change, such as extractive industries, pollution, infrastructure development, damming, and grassland management to the exclusion of the Tibetan nomads, as well as the effects of climate change, including desertification, grassland degradation, and water shortage, also lead to biodiversity loss. The Global Environmental Governance Report 2020 stresses that climate change and biodiversity loss are on the same side of a coin and points to the need for a coherent approach to avoid climate action having unintended negative consequences for biodiversity. Let me briefly turn to these meetings. Though the corona pandemic may lead to further postponement, the 15th meeting of states that have ratified the UN Biodiversity Convention is scheduled to take place in Kunming, China, this year. The aim is to agree on a global biodiversity framework that will set worldwide standards for preserving biodiversity in the years to come. The fact that this conference will take place in Kunming, at the foot of the Tibetan Plateau, poses severe restrictions, but also creates opportunities for international advocacy. The downside is that the conference takes place in China, where any open and critical debate is stifled or at best tightly controlled. Normally at large international conferences, there is a lively, critical and open debate among civil society groups about the topics on the agenda. While the outcomes of these world conferences are largely predetermined, the media can pick up critical issues brought forward by NGOs. It is questionable to what extent China will allow any independent and, even more importantly, independent Tibetan voices in Kunming. Even if Tibetans with foreign passports would be granted a visa, if the Women's Conference in Beijing in 1995 is anything to go by, they will most likely be extremely restricted in what they can do and say. Yet, personally, I feel that even attempts to be represented and to be heard may gain media attention. In Kunming, China will claim leadership in building an ecological civilization and meeting the target of protecting 17% of its territory for biodiversity. China's green narrative needs to be challenged. China achieved this target chiefly through proclaiming large tracts of land as national parks. These national parks are overwhelmingly situated in Tibetan areas. However, these parks lead to stripping Tibetan nomads of their livelihoods, identity, and dignity under the guise of benign terms like conservation, poverty alleviation, and development. It was just being discussed. ICT, International Campaign for Tibet, advocates for a right-based approach, as was also mentioned by Mr. Knox, to environmental management on the Tibetan plateau, in particular the rights of Tibetan nomads to be included in decisions that affect their livelihoods. A rights-based approach means that the right to development cannot take precedence over biodiversity concerns and the rights of the people directly and indirectly affected, as China claims. China has ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the involuntary resettlement of up to 1.8 million nomads. To make way for national parks raises important questions on China's compliance with Tibetan nomads' rights under this convention. China may use the opportunity of Kunming to take government delegates on a tour to Tibet, obviously with the goal to showcase how well Tibet is doing under Chinese rule and to counter any claims that access to Tibet is restricted. We should ensure that delegations are well prepped before they join these tours so that they are able to critically interpret what they are shown and what they are being told. Environmental rights defenders in Tibet risk imprisonment when they make their voice heard. As was also mentioned by Mr. Knox, Anya Sendra has been sentenced to 7 years for campaigning against illegal mining and the hunting of threatened animals. China misconstrues Tibetan concerns about the environment as political or having a splittist agenda. Government should demand that the Chinese authorities release Tibetan climate activists before the biodiversity conference takes place in Kunming. In November this year, the 26th meeting of states that have ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change will take place in Glasgow. Mr. Sonam Frasi also already referred to this important meeting. Glasgow offers an important opportunity to put Tibet squarely on the international climate change agenda. In the run-up to Glasgow, advocacy organizations like ICT need to make governments and parliaments aware that the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on the Tibetan plateau is not only a regional, but a global issue of great urgency for the future of life on Earth. The Tibetan plateau should be recognized as an area of global concern in the well-being of which all governments have a stake. More information on what is happening on the Tibetan plateau and how the various processes interact is needed. This point was also mentioned by a number of the speakers, by Dechen and Tempa. States should urge China to open up the Tibetan plateau for scientific research and international collaboration and facilitate the creation of a regional environmental council. More thorough, regular, and transparent cross-boundary studies will improve our understanding of the state of the ecosystem. According to Martin Mills, and I quote, "The production of comprehensive regional assays requires both a more systematic approach to data and a deeper level of cooperation between regional governments and scientific communities than is presently practiced." End of quote. The effects of climate change on the Tibetan plateau need to become the subject of international debate and monitoring. The approach taken in the Tibet Policy and Support Act of 2020 may serve as an example. Tibet Policy and Support Act is a US act, US legislation. The act stipulates that the US government, and I quote, "shall pursue efforts to monitor the environment on the Tibetan plateau, including glacial retreat, temperature rise and carbon levels, in order to promote a greater understanding of the effects on permafrost, river flows, grassland and desertification, and the monsoon cycle, and encourage a regional framework on water security or use existing frameworks, such as the Lower Mekong Initiative, to facilitate cooperative agreements among all riparian nations that would promote transparency, sharing of information, pollution regulation, and arrangements on impounding and diversion of waters that originate on the Tibetan plateau." End of quote. Increasingly, security analysts realize that climate change on the Tibetan plateau will have geopolitical security implications. In its World Climate and Security Report 2020, the International Military Council on Climate and Security recognizes that, and I quote, the dramatic climate impacts unfolding on the Tibetan Plateau are manifesting in water crisis throughout the Himalayan region and Greater Asia, and that stresses of climate change are exacerbating disputes that can turn dams and canals into sources of conflict. End of quote. The report expresses concern at the lack of treaties and cooperation mechanisms between China, India, and Bangladesh, potentially sparking conflict over diversion of water by China. We've just heard an example of this. European governments are committed to the European Green Deal, which was adopted in 2020. The Green Deal commits the EU to act as a global leader in the field of environmental protection and to develop stronger climate diplomacy. Last year, during the EU-China leaders meeting, the EU and China decided to set up a high-level environment and climate dialogue. Climate change and environmental degradation on the Tibetan Plateau should be placed firmly on its agenda, particularly as the EU Council recognized that climate change and environmental degradation, including biodiversity and forest loss, are a threat to international stability and security, and that adaptation and resilience to climate change and environmental degradation are a matter of priority. I will end. We have our international advocacy agenda mapped out towards Kunming and Glasgow, but also beyond. There are more and more high-level fora and dialogues where climate change on the Tibetan Plateau should be on the agenda. In a powerful video, Our Only Home, released in January, the Dalai Lama pleads, and I quote, "The Tibetan Plateau needs to be protected, not just for Tibetans, but for the environmental health and sustainability of the entire world." End of quote. In 2009, during a discussion on climate change on the Tibetan Plateau that we organized with the Dalai Lama in The Hague, he said, and I quote, "It is a very serious matter. Over 1 billion human beings' life depends on these rivers. We need more effort to inform and educate people that preservation of ecology is your own interest, your own future." End of quote. The Dalai Lama is the most powerful voice on earth for climate action. We need to do anything we can to amplify his moral and global leadership on the urgent need to protect the Tibetan Plateau. Thank you very much.
To that, an immediate question comes to mind, and then I want to go to Dechen for a question that came from that. In fact, two questions. Firstly, on the Glasgow conference, you mentioned the climate activists being released and allowed to the Kunming conference. Should Britain make that a condition for the Glasgow conference?
I think that, as was also mentioned by Mr. Knox, the situation of environmental rights defenders in Tibetan environmental defenders is a very serious. Many have been arrested, and UN special rapporteurs and others have pleaded for their release. And I feel that having a conference on exactly these issues that these persons are advocating for, while these people are still lingering in prisons, while their appeals are being denied, their prison sentences are being upheld, that's a grave contradiction. So I feel this is a very important practical thing that we can ask our governments, our parliaments to ask China before the conference in Kunming takes place.
And could you just encapsulate for those of our viewers that aren't specifically knowledgeable about the Tibet thing, we have a number of global flashpoints: the Amazon, the melting of the Arctic ice, and that sort of thing. But we've heard in this thing that Tibet seems to be the most important fundamental one of those flashpoints. Is that correct? Could you put that in perspective for us?
Well, I think it is one of the important flashpoints and one of the areas that should be on the agenda of any major world conference dealing with environmental issues, with climate change, with biodiversity, wildlife protection. All these issues are, of course, interlinked. And so far, partially because Tibet is closed, because there is no possibility, like in other areas, to conduct research, to have international researchers freely gathering data and freely exchanging views on the data that they have gathered. There has been, and also because, of course, the attitude of the Chinese towards free and open exchange of information and debate on information, Tibet has just been much less part of these meetings and of these discussions. But given the seriousness of the situation and the urgency of the situation, yes, it should be.
So but just to clarify, the impact that Tibet, the degradation of Tibet can have is more serious or as serious as, say, the Amazon or the Greenland ice cap?
That I am in no position to answer, but that it should be on the agenda as these other areas are, yes, that is definitely it.
Okay. Dechen, we've got some questions for Dechen, Palmo. I'd just like to come back to you, if I could, because this concept you said, how can a state own a river, and then the idea that China can actually completely change the lowlands below by turning the water on and off. What is the international legislation, the international law concerning river water? Dechen, are you there?
Yes.
Ah.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah, and as I mentioned during my presentation, that China is one of the 3 countries that have voted against the UN Watercourse Convention. So China is non-binding to any of the international multilateral international treaty. So, and moreover, China has never signed any kind of treaty with the use of non-navigation use of international rivers with any of the neighboring countries. So that gives China full leverage over the use of these international rivers. Yeah, China haven't signed any treaty with any of the countries.
I'm sorry to interrupt, just to clarify, if it had signed the treaties, what could it not do that it's doing now?
China has downstream countries. They can pursue the Chinese government to sign any kind of treaty with the downstream countries. It would have, before any kind of construction, China would have to discuss or have to, share the data about the rivers flow, about the damming planning. So it would have legislate this damming or the downstream countries.
Okay. John Knox, just to pick up on that, John, if you're still with us, thank that you are. Could you expand on that a bit, the international law regarding whether you can, essentially what we're hearing here, you can threaten the livelihood of a country or several countries by damming up the rivers and then turning the water on and off. How does that stand in international law?
So as Dechen was saying, the UN Convention on the Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, that is everything you do with the river other than use it for shipping people and goods up and downstream. The general international law on this requires that all watercourse states use only equitable and reasonable measures, taking into account the interests of all other watercourse states. So, as she was saying, one of the aspects of that is that before you do things that would affect downstream users, you're supposed to consult with them, you're supposed to provide information to them, you're supposed to essentially work with them to make sure that the downstream harm is not caused. The whole issue of upstream dams on the Mekong River has caused an enormous amount of, let's say, tension with downstream states, which have raised concerns with China directly. I think many people would say that even though China is not a party to the UN Convention, they are nevertheless bound by these general principles because the general principles are part of customary international law. That is the background international law that applies to all states.
So just to put a comparative in that, the United States has not signed the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, that it's bound by it, or it says it's bound by it. And this is a similar situation, is it, on the rivers legislation or law?
I think many people would say that, yes. I personally would be among them. I mean, that is when we're talking about these general rules that just require such general standards as equitable and reasonable use and consulting with downstream states. Yeah, that's, I think, supported by general practice around the world, and China would be obliged by those obligations as well.
Yeah. Zamlha, I want to talk to you a little bit more about because we've got a very interesting question that I'll go to Sonam with. But Zamlha, is there evidence on the whole of the water thing and that? Is there evidence, or what evidence is there of it being really used politically, being used as a weapon? That Tibet has become weaponized, as it were, in China's strategic expansion. Zamlha, are you with us?
Yes, I'm sure.
Good.
I think there has been many cases, particularly in recent years, during the Sino-India conflict on Tibetan border, where because of that conflict, China refused to provide hydrological data to India on one or few of the rivers that come into India. And also there has been other cases. One particular case was that the Brahmaputra, which as it comes into India, it was running black for almost a month, and no one had any understanding of what was really happening. So there could be. So China may or may not acknowledge it, but they are definitely using Tibetan rivers as a strategic weapon against its neighboring country. Even the recent news of China building a super dam on the Tibetan river is also a clear indication of what China intends to do. And also, as my colleague Dechen spoke about the Mekong River that flows into some of almost all of Southeast Asian countries, originate from Tibet Plateau, but China kind of controls that particular river and has the leverage over all of those countries. But it is a Tibetan river that they are using.
Yes, we have a question just in here that feeds into that a bit about the ecological importance of Tibet in the role of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So this is the new geopolitics that's coming up. Are we going to see, Zamlha again, are we going to see Tibet becoming a sort of center point of this, a new flashpoint with, the mining we were talking about, the dams and all of that sort of stuff?
Absolutely, because Tibet is so ecologically so important for Asia and also for Europe and North America. Anything that happens on the Tibet Plateau will have severe implications beyond its border. So say now there are scientific findings which has linked that increased or unstable or extreme form of monsoon we face here in India is somewhere or other is due to rapid change on the Tibet Plateau because of climate change, rapid urbanization, population transport, and other issues. Okay. So anything that happens on the Tibet Plateau surely has implications around Asia and other countries.
Okay, I want to go to Sonam in just a second, but in case I forget, Tempa and Dechen, do you have emails that can be followed up, particularly on your PowerPoint presentations with all those details? Perhaps you could let us know at the end how people can get in touch with you. I'd like to ask, so there's a question here. What should Britain do about Tibet, given its new Indo-Pacific policy? We've got Tibet Lobby Week. Sonam, are you still with us? What do you want to see sanctions against mining companies that take materials from Tibet? What do you want to see done? Sonam, are you with us?
I'm on. Yes, I am. I think one very important thing which came out from all our discussions today is the energy that needs to be put by the international community for the preservation of the Tibetan Plateau. This has one consequence is that China is always afraid of, because China wants, whenever a Tibetan issue is raised in any context, China is all the time, this is a subject that is a Chinese concern only. And that really is the basis upon which the whole climate change so far up to COP26 has gone through, simply because everybody says we need China to be in our fold, to please China, so that whatever the agreement is, China is party to this. And that has biggest drawback in giving the attention to the real problem that we have discussed today, because there is no objective discussion on Tibet's issue like we are doing today in front of a Chinese delegate at the COP26 or COP25 or COP or whatever, because they would simply not listen. So what Britain can do is, Britain wants to be bold in the new world of its new chapter.
Yeah.
Of course, Britain will assess everything as it goes, but what we would like Britain to do is to acknowledge its historical relationship with Free Tibet before, the fact that Tibet was never part of China, and there should not be a constraint on actual discussion on environment and other issues like religious freedom, human rights freedom in terms of this. As long as this discussion is open, then maybe we have a chance to bring Tibet's issue to the rightful place.
But quite specifically, given the Christa mentioned the two conferences coming up and Britain's role, one of them in Glasgow in Britain itself, would you like to see sanctions against any company that deals with the raw materials mined out of Tibet?
I think there is international pressure on this already, but to have a sanction, of course, if we can identify things, yes, but in all the international international ventures that's happening in China, where related to human rights, environment, there is international pressure already, and to have a sanction is really identifying the actual company itself and the European and Western countries to have the confidence that they can manage without Chinese dictate.
And just quickly, the second question is, given that we were talking about the international law, would you like to see an international tribunal, such as in the Permanent Court of Arbitration or something like that, that would look at the way the rivers are handled as a breach of international law?
Oh, that would be very, very welcome, because at least what is true, and one of our panels said, anything the Chinese, there's no transparency in any of the discussions, what is happening. So something like this would be a very good opportunity for the whole world.
Lord, and I'm not sure if it's right, I might go back to John Knox for this, but would your Tibetan government in exile be prepared to launch that inquiry? And then, John, maybe we can ask you after we've had an answer to that, we can ask you whether that's possible or not. Sonam?
I think if there is a case to fight, it's quite a difficult issue. In which court it will we can fight this on, and Hague has proven that for a stateless organization, this is a no-go area. Unfortunately, there was a.
Okay. John, very quickly, is it possible would it be technically possible for the Tibetan government in exile to launch such an action in an international tribunal?
I mean, honestly, probably not, because the international tribunals generally are limited to the jurisdiction of states that belong to them, and so only recognized states can bring claims. So it would really be up to the lower Mekong River states, such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, if they chose to do so.
And has there ever been a suggestion that that should be done, or it would help?
There may have been, although I'm not aware of it. I think the general attitude is that it would be more effective to operate through diplomatic channels. There's always a question, even if you are able to get some kind of judgment, what the effect of the judgment would be. So
it didn't help in the South China Sea, did it?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the benchmark. Thank you for that, the panel, which we'll come back to just after. We're now going to Barry Gardiner. Barry, are you still here? And you are going to sum up the debate concisely for us and tell us what it's all about. Thank you.
Goodness me, summing up Tibet concisely. Well, look, first of all, thank you to all our panelists for a fascinating discussion. I would start where Lord Bruce started, and he talked of Tibet as the roof of the world. And of course, if you destroy your roof, what is left to protect the house? That seems to me a fundamental question that runs through all of the speeches that we've heard. And it was really important that John linked together the nexus of crises that we face globally, the environmental, the biodiversity, the climate, the health crisis, with the human rights crisis. Because for many years, people who have been engaged in climate action, I think of reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, what's known as REDD+. Many years ago, 20 years ago or so, people thought that reduced emissions from deforestation was a cheap win in climate, until they the difficulties around working with indigenous communities, making sure that the rights framework was in place, the correct rights framework was in place, and finding that, in fact, very often the different levels of rights, whether they were land rights that existed at a government level, whether they existed at a state level, or indeed at a local level, how they all played out and how you ensured that that sort of engagement, involvement, and advocacy and consultation, working in partnership with local people, was to go on. And here it is absolutely clear that just as in forest protection, so with rivers, and of course we've talked about the non-navigational uses of watercourses, it is fundamentally important that if you're trying to solve a global problem, you work as a global community to resolve it. And here we have a political problem because we're not working as a global community to solve it. Now, yes, we heard about the mining resources, the copper, the gold, the rare earth minerals, that the lithium that is at stake here, and we heard about the trade relations, and I can't remember who it was that asked the question. It may have been you yourself, Humphrey, that talked about how we might control this within supply chains. And here, if you look at something that happened recently in the UK, in the budget, the Chancellor talked about giving a new remit to the Bank of England. That was very welcome, because it was a remit that was to look at climate change and environmental issues. At the moment, the Bank of England's bond portfolio, its corporate bond structure portfolio, is actually aligned with 3.5 degrees of global warming. And it's really important, if we're moving that, if the bank is going to move that remit to align it with the Paris Agreement and ultimately with net zero, then that's a really key and important move that government is taking. And of course, other governments can do the same in order to try and ensure that that takes place. But it's more than that. And I and others certainly have been calling in the international community, not just for mandatory reporting from companies about the climate-related financial risks that they face, but actually about the sustainability and the wider environmental risks that companies face, and being transparent and reporting on those, having that as part of mandatory reporting. Now, that would go a very long way to ensuring the sort of transparency over the international trade in not only minerals, we see it in all sorts of commodities that are environmentally of concern, whether that's palm oil, whether it's, well, beef, whatever it is, it's important that that framework is in place. Now, I was really taken by the way in which Dechen set out many of the problems that have been created. And I thought it was really significant the way in which she showed her understanding of politicians. First, create a problem. Then when people complain, offer to solve it for them and expect to get praise for it. Politicians have been doing that for a very long time. And of course, that is what is going on here in terms of the control of the water flow from the plateau. And the program that Eyes on the Earth have, I think is very important. The US program to do satellite mapping to make transparent what is going on, I think is really important. And transparency, of course, is the key to all of this. It's the key ultimately to democracy. Here we are, the Democracy Forum. If you don't have transparency, you cannot have free, informed, democratic debate. Now, thank you, Christa. It took a long time, but eventually someone got to COP15 and Kunming. And I was delighted with all that you said around the two COPs, COP26 in Glasgow and COP15 in Kunming. And I think it's really important to understand the significance of Kunming. It is the first International UN Convention conference that has been hosted in China. And the Chinese really do want it to be a success. They are conscious, I'm certain they are conscious. I've spoken with Minister Wang Ranqiu, who's the president of the COP, the president designate of COP15. I'm aware that they are very conscious that the world has now, for 20 years, been talking in decade-long programs of resolving the loss of biodiversity. Back in 2010, we set in place the Aichi framework, the Aichi targets that were set in Nagoya at the conference there. And of course, we have failed to meet them. Prior to that, we had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the work that went on, where I even remember as a minister in the department in the mid-2000s, coming in and being given a badge that said, Biodiversity 2010. I said, what's this badge about? And they said it's to halve the loss of, to reduce the rate of loss of biodiversity by 2010. And I said, oh, that's great. Well, so what was the rate of biodiversity loss? And the officials looked around and said, well, actually, we don't know. But we failed. We failed to halt the loss of biodiversity in 2010. We failed in 2020. And here we are beginning a new decade. And China is really, really committed to setting in place targets that don't fail. Now, there are two ways you can do that. You can either reduce the aspiration level of the targets themselves so they're easy to meet, vacuous targets. And indeed, some of the targets that came out in the zero draft for COP15 were simply that. They were vacuous targets. You could have achieved them by reducing some of the endangered species by actually allowing them to go extinct, then they would no longer be endangered. So they were vacuous targets. But there is a gradual firming up of those targets going on. And I think we do need very serious diplomatic engagement with China at an early stage. It should have been going on a lot longer in order to ensure that there is real cooperation that we bring to COP15 and that they bring to COP26 in return. And I think we need to be looking for areas where we can engage together, because this is critical. Humphrey, you asked what I think has to be the weirdest question. I think you asked it of Christa. The weirdest question since my 6-year-old many years ago asked me who would win a fight between a tiger and a polar bear. You asked whether the crisis at the third pole was more important than the crisis in the Amazon. And the answer is, you've got to solve them all. If you don't solve them all, you solve nothing. This is complex. I go back to what John said at the beginning. It is a nexus of problems. You cannot pick one strand and think that you can pull it out and sort the whole. As it unravels, it brings everything else with it. And that's why highlighting different elements, as we've done today, is important, so we get a clear perspective of what that whole is. That's what democracy is about. It's about clarity of what you're trying to achieve. It's about transparency about what the conditions are. And it's about genuine engagement, not simply shouting at each other, but genuine engagement to achieve what are shared ends.
Barry, thank you very much. And that is the end of, and thank you for summing that up so well. I just will pick up with one question before you get, it's about this issue of the advocacy, the transparency, and persuading China, both in Kunming and Glasgow, to release prisoners and all that sort of thing. What should the British government do on that, Barry?
You suggested that a condition of engaging to our common good was that that we should impose a condition. It doesn't matter what the condition is, whether it's that political prisoners be released, that human rights are not being violated. All of you can impose conditions, and the moment you do impose conditions for sitting round the table, you get other conditions imposed back on you. And it is not a constructive way to bring people in to engage in the international arena. We have to understand that people have different national aspirations, but hope that we are all trying to achieve a resolution of what is a global common problem. And in that hope, work conscientiously to establish and enlarge the common ground. That to me is what it is to be human, to be rational, to be a democrat. It's to try and engage in that debate, to create that common ground and enlarge it. But the moment you say, you can't take part in the conversation until you do what I say, you've lost it. You've lost the engagement. And of course, there are fundamental principles of human rights that everything that we're talking about here are connected with. And that's why I used the example. I did a lot of work on Red Plus at one stage, where we were talking with the ejidos, the local communities in Mexico, about Red Plus and reduced emissions from deforestation. It is about rights. All of this is about rights. It's about our common rights. But we have to do it together. And to do that, we have to have people engaged and round the table talking to each other.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Barry, for answering that so comprehensively. And thank you to the panel, John H. Knox, Zamlha, Tempa, Gyaltsen, Dechen, Palmo, Christa, Meindersma. I think we do have an email up there for Tempa at least, and for Lord Bruce for setting out so clearly the issues of Tibet and the environmental damage there. I urge you to read the sister publication, Asian Affairs, because there's stuff in here that you won't read in the mainstream press that brings out these very specialist debates that we have. And we are having another debate in a month's time, roughly a month's time, on the Democracy Forum. So Asian Affairs, the Democracy Forum, thank you very much, all of you, for being there, wherever you are in the world, and goodbye.
Thank you.